He's violating Section 7, subsection B. That fence is an eyesore, and it's coming down today. The voice, sharp enough to curdle milk, belonged to Brenda, our HOA president. I'm a wildlife biologist, and the fence she was screaming about wasn't for decoration. It was the only thing keeping bears from treating our neighborhood like an all-you-can-eat buffet. She was pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the demolition crew she'd hired, who were already starting to pull up the posts. "Madam," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "that is a specialized wildlife deterrent fence. Tearing it down is a dangerously stupid idea." She just laughed. A little did she know, she had just rung the dinner bell for every predator in the surrounding 20,000 acres of national forest. The story of how her obsession with curb appeal led to the complete and utter collapse of her little suburban kingdom is truly insane. Stick around and drop a comment letting me know what state you're watching from, because you won't believe what happened next. My journey to this particular corner of suburban warfare began, ironically, with a search for peace. I bought my home on the edge of a new development precisely because it backed onto a vast national forest. It was the perfect blend of civilization and wilderness, a place where I could work and live in harmony with the environment I dedicated my life to studying. The developer, an old-school guy with more common sense than cash, understood the unique challenges of the location. A condition of the final plat approval from the county, and a key selling point for me, was the installation of protective measures along the forest boundary. My property was the largest on that boundary line, so the responsibility and the prepaid installation fell to me. It wasn't your typical white picket fence. It was a high-tensile, multi-strand, low-voltage electrified fence. It looked serious and purposeful, because it was. It delivered a non-lethal but deeply unpleasant shock, just enough to teach a curious 600-pound black bear that the juicy smells from our barbecues and trash cans were not worth the trouble. It was a silent guardian, a technological shepherd that kept the peace between man and beast. For 3 years, it worked perfectly. We had deer, we had raccoons, we had the occasional fox trotting by. But the big predators, the ones that could cause real problems, they knew to keep their distance. The homeowners who were here from the beginning understood and appreciated it. We were living a rare dream, enjoying the beauty of the wild without the danger. Then Brenda arrived. Brenda moved in 2 years ago, buying the biggest house in the center of the development. She came from some sterile, gated community in another state where the only wildlife was the poodle in her neighbor's handbag. She drove a pristine, pearlescent white Range Rover that never saw a speck of dust, and her uniform consisted of eye-wateringly expensive Lululemon outfits that she wore for everything except, it seemed, actual exercise. Within 6 months, through a campaign of aggressive friendliness and backhanded compliments, she got herself elected HOA president. Her platform was simple: elevate the community's prestige by enforcing a radical vision of aesthetic uniformity. Lawn ornaments were the first to go. Then came the mailboxes. Everyone had to buy a new, absurdly expensive model from a company owned by her brother-in-law. Her reign was one of petty tyrannies and whispered complaints, a slow-motion coup against individuality. My fence was her final boss. To her, it wasn't a vital piece of safety infrastructure. It was just an ugly, utilitarian scar on her perfect suburban masterpiece. It didn't match the decorative aluminum fencing she was pushing everyone else to install. The letters started arriving a year ago. The first was a friendly reminder of the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. I responded with a polite letter of my own, enclosing a copy of my deed, the original development plan filed with the county, and a detailed explanation from my perspective as a wildlife biologist on the fence's critical function. I explained the principles of non-lethal wildlife management and how the fence created a landscape of fear for predators, teaching them to avoid the entire development without harm. I thought that would be the end of it. How naive I was. The second letter was colder, citing fines for non-compliance. My response was more forceful. I included documentation of the fence's legal status as a pre-existing developer-installed safety feature that predated her entire HOA administration. I CC'd the county planning office. I even had a brief chat with George, an older resident who lived 2 doors down. He was one of the original homeowners. "Watch out for that one, son," he'd warned me over a beer on his porch. She got the board to fine the Millers $500 because their basketball hoop was a shade of orange she found garish. She's got the rest of them wrapped around her little finger. He was right. The HOA board, a collection of timid sycophants and people too busy to argue, were her enablers. They saw her obsession as a positive, a sign of someone who cared about property values. They rubber-stamped her every decision, including the one to declare my fence a public nuisance that must be removed. I attended the next HOA meeting, armed with a PowerPoint presentation. I showed them migration patterns, population density maps of local bear populations, and case studies of what happens when humans and predators are forced into conflict. I wasn't just a resident. I was an expert in the field, offering free, vital consultation. They looked at me with blank expressions. Brenda spoke for all of them. "Mr. Harrison, we appreciate your little animal lecture," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But this is a matter of community standards, not a National Geographic special. The bylaws are clear. Your fence is ugly and non-compliant." She saw my data as a diversion, my expertise as an arrogant attempt to be an exception to her rules. My warnings about bear encounters were, to her, nothing more than outlandish fear-mongering. The vote was unanimous. The fence had to go. I was given 30 days to remove it, or the HOA would do it for me and bill me for the privilege. I knew then that logic had left the building. This wasn't about a fence anymore. It was about power. And I was about to be on the receiving end of a very sharp lesson in what happens when you challenge a suburban despot. The call came while I was in my lab, analyzing soil samples. It was George, his voice crackling with urgency. "They're here, son. Brenda and a work crew. They've got a truck and tools. They're taking down your fence right now." A cold fury, clean and hard as diamond, replaced the academic calm I usually operated with. I threw my lab coat on a chair, mumbled an apology to my assistant, and broke every speed limit getting home. I skidded to a stop at the curb and saw a scene of supervised destruction. A crew of 3 men were methodically pulling up the posts of my fence, tossing the expensive insulators and high-tensile wire into a heap on the ground. And there she was, Brenda, standing on the edge of my lawn with her arms crossed, a smug, triumphant smirk on her face. She was wearing a canary-yellow tennis skirt and a crisp white polo, looking for all the world like she had just won a championship match. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" I yelled, striding towards her. "This is private property." She didn't even flinch. "I'm enforcing the board's decision, Mr. Harrison," she said coolly, holding up a piece of paper. It was an invoice. "As you were notified, the HOA has taken action to remedy your long-standing violation. This is the bill for the demolition service. You'll also find a $1,000 fine for non-compliance attached. It's due in 15 days. Her audacity was breathtaking. She had trespassed on my property, hired a crew to destroy a $5,000 safety installation, and was now trying to bill me for it. I was so angry I could barely speak. "Brenda, you have no idea what you've just done," I said, my voice low and shaking. "You haven't just destroyed my property. You've put every person in this neighborhood in danger." She actually rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, spare me the drama. It's a fence. We're going to have a beautiful, uniform community now. You should be thanking me." She turned on her heel, got into her immaculate Range Rover, and drove off, leaving me standing there amidst the ruins of my carefully constructed piece. For a few minutes, I just stared at the empty space where my fence used to be. The anger was still there, a hot coal in my chest, but it was being rapidly replaced by something else, a cold, methodical resolve. She thought this was the end of it. She thought she'd won. What she didn't understand was that she hadn't just knocked over a fence, she'd kicked over a beehive, and she was about to find out what it was like to get stung. I spent the rest of the day in a state of controlled rage. The old me, the conflict-averse academic, would have stewed, maybe written another angry letter. But Brenda had pushed me past that. She had mistaken my patience for weakness and my expertise for arrogance. Now, she was going to get a taste of what that expertise really looked like when weaponized. My revenge wouldn't be swift and hot. It would be slow, documented, and crushing. That night, my war room, formerly my home office, came to life. This was my new research project, and I would approach it with the same rigor and meticulous detail as any peer-reviewed study. Project Pandora, I called it. Brenda had opened the box, and I was going to document everything that flew out. My first step was legal. I spent 2 hours on the phone with a lawyer I knew, a shark named Marcus who specialized in HOA litigation. I explained the entire situation, from the developer's agreement to the final, triumphant smirk on Brenda's face. Marcus was practically salivating. She did what? He kept saying. Oh, this is beautiful. This is gross negligence, destruction of property, breach of covenant. She may have even opened herself up to personal liability by acting so far outside her authority. Don't do anything yet. Don't sue. Don't even send a nasty email. Let the consequences manifest. A judge will care about a destroyed fence. But a judge, and a jury, will be fascinated by the consequences of that destruction. Document everything. Everything. My second step was data collection. The forest was my laboratory, and my former fence line was now the primary research area. I had a dozen high-definition, night vision game cameras in my lab. I spent the next evening setting them up in strategic, concealed locations along my property line, creating an invisible web of surveillance. Any creature crossing that line would be photographed and logged. I set up a new database on my computer, complete with timestamps, species identification, and behavioral notes. This wasn't just about bears anymore. I would document the deer, the coyotes, the bobcat savory animal that would now be drawn into the vacuum of safety that my fence once provided. The third, and most crucial step, was human intelligence. I needed to document the community impact. I started by taking a walk, a casual stroll through the neighborhood. I ran into Sarah from across the street, who was trying to coax her terrified Jack Russell Terrier back inside. "It's the strangest thing," she said. "He's usually so brave, but for the past 2 nights he just stands at the back door and growls at the woods." I made a note. I saw another neighbor, Mike, scrubbing out his trash can with bleach. "Second time this week," he grumbled. "Something got the lid off and dragged trash all over the yard. Never happened before." I sympathized, and I made another note. I started a separate file. Community anecdotes. Every conversation, every piece of security footage a neighbor was willing to share, went into the file, dated and cataloged. Most people hadn't made the connection yet. They saw these as isolated incidents, the minor annoyances of living near the wilderness. But I knew better. This was the overture. The main performance was yet to come. The first irrefutable piece of evidence arrived a week later. It was a 2:17 a.m. capture on camera 4, positioned near the old gate. A young male black bear, probably 2 or 3 years old, recently pushed away by its mother. It was small for a bear, maybe 150 pounds, but it was a bear nonetheless. It tentatively sniffed the air where the fence line used to be, took a hesitant step, then another. There was no jolt, no unpleasant shock. The way was clear. It ambled across my yard, a dark shadow moving through the moonlight, and disappeared between the houses. I saved the video file, labeled it Subject 0, and emailed it to Marcus with a single sentence. "And so it begins." His reply came back 30 seconds later. "Excellent." The first phase was what I privately termed the nuisance wave. It started small, almost predictably. My meticulous logs began to fill with data points that painted a clear picture of animal habituation. The young bear, Subject 0, became irregular, his appearances on my cameras growing more frequent and bolder. He was the scout, the pioneer, discovering an untapped territory, rich with caloric opportunity. Soon, he was not alone. Within 2 weeks of Brenda's triumphant demolition, nearly every resident on the forest-adjacent side of the community was experiencing problems. Trash cans became the primary target. Brenda, in her infinite wisdom, sent out a passive-aggressive email reminding everyone of the HOA rule requiring bear-proof trash cans. The irony was that most of us already had them. But a determined bear, especially one not spooked by an electric fence, views a bear-proof latch as a delightful puzzle box. We'd wake up to find the heavy plastic cans dragged 50 yards into the woods, the lids pried open, and a trail of coffee grounds and chicken bone debris leading back to our driveways. I documented every instance I could, collecting photos from my neighbors of their ravaged bins like a morbid scrapbook artist. Then came the bird feeders. They were stripped from their hooks, the plastic tubes shattered, the last few seeds licked clean from the wreckage. Expensive suet cages were twisted into unrecognizable shapes. Brenda's response was another email. Please be advised that bird feeders can be an attractant for vermin. She was classifying 400-pound apex predators as vermin. A telling insight into her complete lack of understanding of the situation. People were annoyed. There was grumbling in the neighborhood Facebook group. But still, the connection wasn't fully made by most. It was just an active year for bears, a phrase I heard more than once. They didn't see it as a direct consequence of a specific action. They saw it as a random act of nature. I, however, had the data. My charts showed a near-zero incidence rate for the 3 years prior, and a vertical spike in the days following the fence's removal. My legal file was getting thicker by the day. Phase 2, the property damage escalation, began a month after the fence came down. The animals, now comfortable and facing no resistance, started to view our homes not as threatening human structures, but as giant, food-filled containers. A bear tore the screen door clean off the miller's back porch to get at a bag of potting soil it mistook for food. It left deep, 5-inch gouges in their solid wood door before giving up. The cost to repair it was over $800. I got photos and a copy of the repair bill for my file. A week later, one of the newer, more timid board members, a man named David, came home to find his garage door looking like it had been assaulted with a pickaxe. A bear had tried to peel the aluminum back like a tin can to get at the residual smell from a bag of dog food he'd had in there the week before. The damage was over $2,000. David was shaken. He had been one of Brenda's loyal voters, convinced by her arguments about property values. Now, those values were being literally clawed apart. This incident was significant. I immediately drafted a formal, registered letter to the entire HOA board, including Brenda. In it, I laid out a preliminary summary of my findings. I attached a dozen of the clearest photographs, including the damage to the Millers and David's homes. I detailed the more than 200 documented incursions in the last 30 days. I respectfully pointed out that these incidents began precisely after the community's primary wildlife deterrent was removed by their order. I ended the letter by formally stating that the HOA was now on notice, and that their continued inaction constituted gross negligence that was actively endangering residents and causing significant financial harm. I sent it via certified mail and got the delivery receipt. Legally, they could no longer claim ignorance. Brenda's response was to ignore my letter entirely at the next meeting, an act of defiance I had fully expected and which my lawyer, Marcus, was delighted by. Instead, she doubled down. She hired a wildlife control company. I use the term loosely. It was one guy, in a rusty Ford Ranger, who charged the HOA $1,500 to drive around the neighborhood and put up a half-dozen flimsy metal signs that read, "Bir Araya. Do not feed wildlife." It was a completely useless, performative gesture designed to create the illusion of action while addressing nothing. I took a picture of Brenda posing proudly next to one of the signs for the community newsletter. It was perfect. The real turning point, however, came with the arrival of the big one. There was a particular male bear in this forest I knew well from my professional work. A massive, mature boar, probably tipping the scales at over 600 pounds. He had a long, healed-over scar that ran down the left side of his snout, a memento from a long-forgotten fight. I'd always called him Scarface. He was intelligent, dominant, and for years had treated the boundary of the development with respect because of the fence. He knew the tingle, and he stayed in his domain. But with the fence gone, and with dozens of smaller bears now feasting without consequence, it was only a matter of time before the king came to claim his share of the bounty. His first appearance on my cameras was chilling. He didn't slink or hesitate like the younger bears. He strode across my property line with an unnerving confidence, an apex predator surveying a newly acquired territory. He was the one who began causing the truly expensive damage. He methodically dismantled a fancy outdoor kitchen on a neighbor's patio, looking for the grease trap. He tore a brand new $1,000 hot tub cover to shreds, seemingly just for the fun of it. He learned the trash pickup schedule and would make a grand tour of the neighborhood the night before, toppling cans with impunity. Panic began to set in. The grumbling in the Facebook group turned to genuine fear. People were afraid to let their kids play in their own backyards. The idyllic community Brenda had envisioned was rapidly transforming into a 24/7 horror movie. And through it all, she refused to acknowledge the cause. Her arrogance, a retaining wall against the flood of reality. But I knew, with the certainty of a scientist watching a predictable chemical reaction, that the flood was coming for her, too. Scarface was no respecter of persons or property values. And Brenda's house, with its meticulously manicured lawn and air of untouchable prestige, was just another stop on his nightly route. The catalyst I had been waiting for arrived on a Tuesday evening. It was a beautiful, crisp autumn night, the kind that makes you want to leave your windows open to catch the cool breeze. Brenda, it seems, had a similar thought about her garage door. Perhaps she was unloading organic kale and Pellegrino from her Range Rover after a trip to Whole Foods. Perhaps she simply forgot. The reason was irrelevant. The opportunity was all that mattered. For Scarface, an open garage door is not just an invitation, it's a command performance. He had been making his way down the street, a phantom of insatiable hunger, when he smelled it. The faint but alluring aroma of artisanal, grain-free salmon and sweet potato kibble. Brenda, naturally, didn't just buy regular dog food for her 2 yapping bichons. She bought the kind that cost more per pound than prime rib, and she stored it in a large, aesthetically pleasing, but decidedly not bear-proof, wicker basket in her garage. The scene, as pieced together later from a neighbor's security camera and Brenda's own hysterical 911 call, was one of quiet, methodical destruction. Scarface didn't rush. He strolled into the pristine, epoxy-floored garage like he owned the place. He located the source of the delicious smell, tipped over the wicker basket, and proceeded to have a leisurely, 20-minute feast. In the process, he knocked over a stand of Brenda's husband's golf clubs, nudged a can of white paint onto the floor where it oozed slowly under her Range Rover, and, as a final act of desecration, used an empty bag of expensive fertilizer as a napkin. He wasn't aggressive, he was just hungry. When he was done, he calmly backed out of the garage and ambled off into the darkness, leaving behind a scene of utter chaos. Brenda discovered the aftermath when she went to put the trash out. Her scream, according to George, who lived close enough to hear it, could have peeled the paint off a battleship. Suddenly, the bear problem wasn't a community issue to be managed with signs and condescending emails. It was a personal violation. The sanctity of her perfect white garage had been breached. The bear had been in her house. The panic was immediate and absolute. Within an hour, my inbox lit up with a notification. An emergency community-wide meeting had been called for the following Thursday. The subject line, in all caps, was, "Action Plan for Aggressive Wildlife Threat." I smiled. The time had finally come. Brenda's goal for this meeting, as outlined in her frantic email, was twofold. First, she was proposing an immediate, massive special assessment. Her plan was to build a wall. Not a fence, a wall. A 10-foot-high, solid concrete and steel monstrosity that would have made the community look less like a prestigious enclave and more like a minimum security prison. The estimated cost was astronomical, nearly $20,000 per household. Second, she was personally petitioning the state's Fish and Wildlife Department to designate our area as a high-risk conflict zone which would give them authorization to trap and euthanize what she called the problem bears. She was done with deterrence. She wanted blood. She had declared war on the very wilderness she'd claimed to appreciate from a distance. She had no idea that I was about to turn her war council into a court-martial. I spent the next 48 hours in a fever of preparation. This wasn't just my fight anymore. The tide of public opinion had turned violently against Brenda after the sheer cost of her proposed wall was announced. The timid board member, David, whose garage had been mauled, was now my staunchest ally. He had seen the light, or rather, the claw marks. He helped me rally support, ensuring that a quorum, and then some, would be at that meeting. My lawyer, Marcus, had coached me extensively. Don't get emotional, he'd instructed. Be a scientist. Present the data. Let the facts be the hammer, not your voice. We're not just deposing a queen. We're staging a revolution. I prepared my presentation, the culmination of 2 months of relentless documentation. It was my magnum opus of suburban revenge. The community hall was packed. I had never seen so many residents at an HOA meeting. The air was thick with anger, fear, and resentment. Brenda stood at the front of the room, next to a projector screen. She looked haggard, her usual icy composure replaced by a righteous, frenzied energy. She launched into a dramatic, fear-mongering speech, complete with grainy photos of the mess in her garage. She spoke of unprecedented aggression and the imminent danger to their children. She unveiled her plan for the prison wall, glossing over the crippling financial burden and framing it as the only possible solution. When she got to the part about killing the bears, a low murmur of unease went through the crowd. Many people had moved here for the wildlife. When she finally finished, she asked for questions, but before anyone could speak, I stood up. I don't have a question, I said, my voice calm and carrying through the tense silence. But I do have a presentation that I believe will provide some much-needed context. Brenda's face tightened. This is not the time for another one of your lectures, Mr. Harrison. David, the board member, stood up from his seat. I think we should hear him out, he said firmly. A chorus of agreement rose from the audience. Defeated, Brenda gestured angrily towards the podium. Fine, make it quick. I walked to the front, plugged my laptop into the projector, and took a deep breath. Showtime. The first slide that appeared on the screen was titled, The Baseline, A Community in Balance. I showed them 3 years of data logs from before my fence was destroyed. A handful of deer sightings, a fox, 0 bear incursions. I explained the science of the electrified deterrent fence calmly and clearly. This was our reality, I said. A safe, effective, and humane system that maintained a respectful distance between us and large predators. My next slide was a single, high-resolution photo. It was a picture of Brenda, arms crossed, smirking proudly as the demolition crew ripped the first post of my fence out of the ground. An audible gasp went through the room. I followed it with a screenshot of the official HOA letter ordering the removal, and the $1,000 fine she'd levied against me. The murmuring grew louder. This, I said, is the inciting incident. The day our community's protection was unilaterally dismantled in the name of aesthetics. Then came the heart of my presentation. The aftermath. A case study in predictable consequences. I presented a timeline that began the day the fence came down. I showed them the video of Subject 0, the first young bear, stepping across the unprotected line. Then came the montage. Dozens and dozens of photos and video clips sourced from my cameras and those of over 15 of my neighbors. Raided trash cans, destroyed bird feeders, clawed up doors, damaged sheds. And then, the star of the show, Scarface. They saw him dismantling the outdoor kitchen. They saw him shredding the hot tub cover. They saw the chilling, crystal-clear footage of him calmly walking out of Brenda's own garage, licking his lips. Finally, I put up the smoking gun. It was a map of the entire development. I had created a heat map overlaying the location of every single documented bear sighting. It was a terrifying bloom of red and orange, but the origin point was unmistakable. A bright, angry red spot pulsed over my property, the breach point. with the incursion spreading out like a contagion, house by house, until the heat map was glowing over the entire forest-adjacent side of the neighborhood, with a particularly bright spot right over Brenda's house. "The data is clear," I said, turning to face the stunned crowd. "Every single problem we are now facing, every dollar of damage, every sleepless night, is a direct, foreseeable, and documented consequence of one single, reckless decision." To cap it off, I displayed a copy of the registered letter I had sent to the board a month prior, warning them of this exact scenario. They were informed, they knew the risks, and they chose to do nothing. I clicked to my final slide. It simply read, "Questions?" The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and deadly. Brenda stood frozen, her face a mask of pale, horrified disbelief. She had walked into the meeting as a warrior queen rallying her troops. I had just turned her into the villain of the story, in front of all her subjects, using nothing but her own actions and my meticulous, undeniable proof. The silence in the room stretched for a long, delicious moment before it shattered. It wasn't me or Brenda who broke it. It was George, the old-timer who had first warned me about her. He stood up, his voice booming with the authority of a founding resident. "So, let me get this straight," he said, pointing a finger not at me, but at Brenda. "You tore down the one thing that was keeping us safe, ignored an expert when he told you exactly what would happen, let the whole neighborhood get torn up for 2 months, and now you want us to pay 20 grand each to build a prison wall because a bear ate your fancy dog food?" The room erupted. It wasn't a debate. It was a detonation. People were on their feet, shouting. Not at the bears, not at me, but at her. The anger was visceral, a tidal wave of frustration and betrayal. Voices flew from every corner. "You're liable for the damage to my porch," someone yelled. "I want the HOA to pay for my new garage door," shouted another. Brenda tried to regain control, stepping to the podium and shouting, "This is out of order. We have to deal with the threat." But her authority had evaporated. A woman in the front row just laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You are the threat, Brenda. Your stupidity is the threat." It was at that moment that my lawyer, Marcus, who had been sitting quietly in the back, chose to stand up. He wasn't loud, but his voice cut through the chaos like a razor. "Perhaps I can offer some legal clarity," he said. The room quieted, eager for a new target for their attention. Marcus walked calmly to the front. "Based on the evidence presented by Mr. Harrison tonight," he began, gesturing toward the damning heat map still on the screen, "it is my professional opinion that the HOA board, under the direction of President Brenda, has acted with gross negligence. They knowingly destroyed private property, which served a documented and vital community safety function. They were formally warned of the foreseeable consequences and chose to ignore those warnings. As such, the HOA is legally liable for every dollar of property damage sustained by residents resulting from that decision." He let that sink in for a moment before delivering the finishing blow. "Furthermore," he continued, looking directly at Brenda, whose face had gone from pale to ashen, "any board president who coerces a board into acting so recklessly, so far outside the bounds of reasonable governance, and in direct contradiction of expert advice provided, may be found to have breached their fiduciary duty. This could open them up to personal liability." The word hung in the air, personal liability. The other board members, who had been sitting like statues beside Brenda, now looked at her as if she were radioactive. David, my new ally, seized the moment. He stood up and made a formal motion. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the presidency of Brenda." A dozen voices seconded the motion at once. It was a public execution. The vote was a landslide, a forest of raised hands against her. She was stripped of her power, right there. In front of the entire community she had tried to rule with an iron fist. Her reign was over, not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating click of my final PowerPoint slide. The fallout was swift and satisfying. Brenda, utterly humiliated, didn't even stay for the rest of the meeting. She gathered her purse and walked out of the hall, the sea of her former subjects parting for her without a word. The newly chastened and terrified board, now under David's temporary leadership, immediately moved to settle. There was no negotiation, only surrender. The following week, a construction crew, a different, more professional one, was at my house. They were rebuilding my specialized wildlife deterrent fence to its exact original specifications, all on the HOA's dime. A check arrived in my mailbox that covered Marcus's legal fees down to the last penny. The fines they had levied against me were expunged from the record with a formal letter of apology. It was a total and complete reversal. But the vindication didn't stop at my property line. The board, desperate to avoid a class action lawsuit, established a reimbursement fund. Every resident who had submitted proof of bear-related property damage, from a ravaged trash can to a clawed-up deck, was paid in full. It was a massive financial hit to the HOA's reserve funds, a wound that David announced at the next meeting would likely require a special assessment the following year to replenish. The irony was exquisite. Brenda's obsession with property values had ended up costing everyone, and her legacy would be an annual bill to clean up her mess. As for my data, it proved its value once more. The day after my new fence was fully operational and electrified, the nightly visits stopped, just like that. The game cameras along my property line showed the bears returning, approaching the invisible barrier, and then wisely turning back. Scarface himself made one appearance. He sniffed the air near a post, his sensitive nose likely detecting the faint hum of the current, and gave a low, rumbling grunt of what I could only interpret as annoyed recognition. Then he turned and lumbered back into the woods, returning to his own kingdom. The peace was restored. The entire neighborhood had received a crash course in wildlife management and the folly of arrogant leadership. At the next election, I was unanimously voted onto the board, given the newly created title of Wildlife and Safety Liaison, to ensure that data, not decorum, would guide our decisions moving forward. Brenda's story came to a quiet end a few months later. Ostracized by her neighbors and facing the specter of that personal liability Marcus had so deftly introduced, she put her house on the market. It sold quickly, and I watched one Saturday as a moving truck loaded up her perfectly coordinated furniture. The last I ever saw of her was the back of that pearlescent white Range Rover, finally bearing a few smudges of dust as it drove out of our community for the last time. It had been a long, exhausting battle of suburban warfare. But as I stood on my back porch that evening, looking out at the woods under the protection of my fully functional, beautifully utilitarian fence, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I had fought the board, and I had won. I had proven that reason could triumph over irrationality, that data was a more powerful weapon than bylaws, and that sometimes the ugliest fence can be the very thing that holds a beautiful community together.